teach his spoiled son a lesson, a hotel owner hires an entire movie production crew to make him believe he has traveled back in time. Louis arrives with his entourage at his father's hotel and demands the most luxurious suite. With no other option, the staff forces another guest to vacate their room to accommodate Louis and his companions. Immediately, the group goes wild, partying and destroying the place. One of Louis's friends later brings in a wallaby as a companion for his pet panther. Upon seeing the exotic animal, the wallaby leaps off the balcony and plunges into the hotel pool. The panther chases after it, and the other guests are horrified to witness the animal attacking its target while Louis and his group cheer them on. News of the event spreads the next day, prompting animal rights activists to protest against the hotel. With the establishment's reputation damaged, the board of directors considers terminating the contract of Louis's father, Jean-François. Outraged, Jean-François storms up to Louis's suite, still teeming with intoxicated partygoers. He wakes his son and scolds him, pointing out that if he loses his role as the hotel's president, Louis will no longer be able to enjoy such privileges. However, Louis dismisses his father's concerns, so Jean-François angrily storms out. That night, Jean-François vents to his wife, Helene, about Louis, lamenting how he has tried different specialists to correct his son's behavior. Helene suggests he spend more time with his stepson, but Jean-François argues that he has no time, especially now that his career is at risk. The following day, Jean-François visits his new hotel, where a commercial is being filmed. There, the director, Chris, complains about the model's lack of emotional expression. As his crew passes by, Chris hatches an idea and whispers something to the boom operator. They resume filming, and the actress walks into one of the bedrooms, gasping when she sees the boom operator wearing ridiculously revealing clothes. This finally elicits the expression Chris was seeking for the ad. Jean-François warns him that the actress might sue for this, but Chris believes that pushing someone to improve doesn't require permission. Soon after, Jean-François boards his helicopter to leave, but as they ascend, he notices the hotel's vast landscape and gets an idea. He then returns to the hotel and offers Chris the opportunity to make his own movie. On another night, Louis stumbles out of a bar, only to discover his car being towed. He chases after the tow truck, only to be hit by a tranquilizer dart. Louis later awakens to the sound of a bell. Before he can understand his surroundings, a man yanks him out of bed, urging him to hurry. The man, Sylvain, warns that their boss will beat him if he's found still asleep. Suddenly, Bavelin storms in and hurls a bucket at Louis, ordering him to tend to the Viscount. Before Bavelin can strike him, Sylvain pleads for leniency. In response, Bavelin throws Sylvain against the wall for speaking without permission. He then continues assaulting Sylvain, terrifying Louis. Bavelin orders Louis to grab the bucket and get to work. Frightened, Louis picks it up and rushes outside. To his shock, he finds himself in a medieval village. Bavelin steps out, so Louis bolts toward the nearby estate. There, he finds the Viscount talking with Dr. Celestin about his digestive issues. Just then, the Viscount feels nature's call, and Celestin instructs Louis to prepare the bucket. Still baffled, Louis is assisted by Bavelin in setting up the bucket. The Viscount then relieves himself while Louis watches in horror. Afterward, Celestin examines the contents and informs the Viscount that his health is improving. The men rejoice, but Louis questions why they're celebrating a bowel movement. He insists this is just a prank and flees. However, upon reaching the village's edge, he finds it surrounded by wolves. Terrified, he runs back, only to be pursued by a pack of dogs. Eventually cornered, Louis is dragged back to the estate by the dog's owner and the Viscount's son, Estienne. Estienne plans to punish Louis for fleeing from his father. Louis tries to negotiate, saying his father can pay for his release, but Estienne mocks the suggestion. Just then, Estienne's sister, Isabeau, intervenes to stop her brother. She reminds him that Louis has served them for 15 years, confusing Louis even more. Still, Estienne insists on punishing him. But before he can act, the Viscount complains about the noise. Isabeau uses the moment to persuade their father to spare Louis, and the Viscount tells Estienne that since their mother passed, the village has lacked compassion, and it's time they showed some. Reluctantly, Estienne backs down. Unbeknownst to Louis, the film crew has set up just outside the fake village. Using drones disguised as birds and hidden cameras, Chris and Jean-Francois observe everything unfold. Jean-Francois worries his son could get hurt, but Chris insists that they must maintain the illusion of time travel to pressure Louis into changing. He reassures him that Louis will eventually be compelled to adjust to his new surroundings, thereby giving him an opportunity to change his behavior. Outside their tent, the actors portraying Isabeau, the Viscount, and Bavelin are on a break. The actor playing Estienne then meets up with his girlfriend, Lisa, who also happens to be the production's horse trainer. Later, Louis finds himself in the estate kitchen where Sylvain works. Following the director's instructions, Bavelin enters and commands Louis to assist in the kitchen. With no other option, Louis starts peeling potatoes alongside Sylvain, rambling about how he feels like he's in something out of Back to the Future. Sylvain laughs at this remark, prompting Louis to ask if he knows the film. This question makes Sylvain, Chris, and Jean-Francois uneasy, but thankfully, the actor explains that he laughed simply because the idea of going back to a future sounded absurd. Louis continues speculating that he may have been hit by a car and transported into the past. This leads him to believe that being struck by a vehicle again might return him to his own timeline. Acting on this notion, he runs out and throws himself in front of a wheelbarrow. When that fails, he sprints toward a horse carriage and ends up knocking himself unconscious. Jean-Francois and Chris are terrified that he may be seriously injured. Fortunately, Louis eventually regains consciousness, and the production continues. In the following days, Louis begins making efforts to fit into his new reality, even learning how to better respond to the Viscount's demands. He eventually gives up on the idea of escaping, fearful of the wolves that roam the forest. Observing his son's apparent progress, Jean-Francois decides to invite Helene to show her how things are going. She watches the camera feed with them, under the impression that they've merely hired Louis as an actor. Later, Isabeau pretends to cry in order to get Louis's attention. She complains to him about the Viscount trying to arrange her marriage to a rich but elderly man. Isabeau comments that she would rather marry someone her own age, even if he's only a servant. Despite her flirtation, Louis advises her to go through with marrying the old man, reasoning that he'll likely die soon and she'll inherit his wealth. He then leaves to continue his duties. After he walks away, Isabeau turns to the hidden camera to speak to Chris. She's puzzled as to why Louis doesn't seem attracted to her, and the director assumes it's because he lacks empathy. Jean-Francois counters that his son is used to women constantly pursuing him, so Isabeau's tactics have no impact. Hearing this, Helene realizes that the whole production is a carefully constructed scheme to reform Louis. Jean-Francois reminds her that she was the one who advised him to spend more time with his son, asserting that this is his way of doing so. Helene, however, disagrees, insisting that this doesn't count as quality time with Louis. Their disagreement is interrupted by the sound of Isabeau having trouble handling her horse. Concerned that the incident might expose their charade, Chris quickly sends Lisa to intervene. Lisa soon arrives in costume and manages to calm the horse. However, as she dismounts, Louis catches a glimpse of her modern undergarments. Shocked, he tackles her and begins inspecting her clothes. He freezes when he catches sight between her legs, only for Lisa to kick him off. She walks away, having removed the garment before Louis could get another look. Having seen enough, Helene tells her husband that people aren't playthings for him to manipulate. She storms out, but Jean-Francois follows, insisting that something has genuinely changed in their son. Back inside the tent, they watch as Louis questions another servant about the horse trainer, saying he wants to apologize for disrespecting her. Guided by Chris via earpiece, the actor explains that Lisa is the blacksmith's daughter who cares for the Viscount's horses. In light of this, Lisa is prepped for a new role, although she insists she's not an actress. Chris reassures her that she only needs to accept Louis's apology and then she can leave. Soon after, Louis visits Lisa and apologizes for looking at her body. Referencing the customs he's picked up, he states that a woman who's been seen by a man is no longer considered marriageable, and he feels ashamed for having seen her in that way. Lisa tells him to stay away from her and returns to her modest home. This display of remorse from Louis pleases both Chris and Jean-Francois. Even Helene begins to think that this method might actually teach her stepson some humility. Later, Chris informs the parents that he plans to introduce a romantic subplot to help Louis develop into a hero. He and Jean-Francois have chosen Isabeau for the role, but Helene interjects, pointing out that Louis is clearly more interested in Lisa. Jean-Francois laughs this off, saying his son prefers seductive women like Isabeau. But Helene reminds them of how Louis reacted upon seeing Lisa, convinced that he fell for her instantly. Chris remains skeptical and continues his efforts to push Louis toward Isabeau. On another day, the villagers gather for their annual celebration. Louis, unimpressed by the traditional festivities, teaches the musicians a modern tune. He then starts a conga line with the villagers. Isabeau joins him and expresses a desire to take part in the fun, but he brushes her off. Instead, he later goes looking for Lisa, confirming Helene's suspicion that he prefers the horse trainer. To steer Louis back into the storyline, Sylvain tells him that Isabeau has been crying. Louis, however, merely asks where Lisa is. Seeing this, Sylvain tells him that the trainer is down by the river. When he arrives, however, Louis finds Isabeau instead, pretending to try and drown herself in the river. He rescues her, and she claims she was attempting to escape her engagement. He carries her back to the house, but she refuses to face her father. Instead, Louis places her in one of the carriages. Chris assumes Louis will finally fall for Isabeau. However, Louis simply shuts the carriage door on her and walks away. Helene again points out that Louis isn't interested, prompting the irritated director to sarcastically offer her his job, since she apparently knows better. To his surprise, Helene actually takes his headphones and instructs the crew to get Lisa ready. That evening, Louis finds Lisa outside her house, saying she didn't want to go to the holiday. Louis admits that 21st century parties are cooler, but when she doesn't react, he shrugs and says she doesn't believe him. Following Helene's instructions, Lisa tells Louis she wants to believe him. This encourages Louis to share more about the modern era. He continues talking throughout the night, eventually mentioning how on airplanes the rich and the rest are separated. When Lisa asks what he meant by the rest, Louis explains they are the ones who have to work and save just to afford a flight. He then brings up public transportation and mocks how awful it must be to use it. This offends Lisa, so she reminds him that his job is to clean the bucket where the Viscount relieves himself. She then storms off, leaving Louis dumbfounded. The next day, Lisa apologizes to Helene for snapping at her stepson. She explains that she's met plenty of wealthy men through her job and sees them all as spoiled. Still, Helene believes Louis can change, so she asks Lisa to help teach him how to care about someone other than himself. Meanwhile, Chris fumes over Helene taking control. Jean-Francois reassures him that he still owns the project, so Chris pleads with the director to work with his wife. With that, Chris considers officially hiring Helene as a consultant. He also begins incorporating Lisa into the official cast. However, Estienne is uneasy about involving his girlfriend. He insists the film industry will exploit Lisa's innocence, but his reaction makes her suspect he's really just upset that her role is more prominent than his. That night, Louis turns to Sylvain for advice. He's worried that he hurt Lisa's feelings and wants to make it right. Hearing this, Sylvain suggests he perform a bear dance for Lisa. He even demonstrates the dance, which ends up being more provocative than Louis expected. Afterward, Sylvain tells him to recite a poem for Lisa as well. Otherwise, she might prefer a real bear over him. The following day, Louis approaches Lisa and begins with his poem. He then turns it into a song and dances along. Lisa and the others are amused and touched by his gesture. So that night, Louis thanks Sylvain for the advice. Late that night, Jean-Francois visits his sleeping son. Sylvain sees him and warns that he can't be there. Jean-Francois assures the actor that his son won't wake up, but Louis actually stirs upon hearing his father's voice. Quickly, Sylvain knocks Louis unconscious while Chris drags the father away. Fortunately, the next morning, Louis is convinced he only dreamed of seeing his father. For the next scene, Bavelin reports to the Viscount that Estienne and his companions trashed their inn during a drunken celebration. They even brought a wolf to devour a lamb in front of the other guests. Louis overhears and recalls a time when they bought a wallaby for his panther. Bavelin continues that the king uses the inn for his private affairs. If he finds out it's been wrecked, he'll demand that Estienne be punished. Because of this, the Viscount invites Louis to dine with him, only to ask him to impersonate Estienne so he can take the king's punishment instead. He offers a generous reward, including a bride of Louis's choosing. This last offer makes him pause, as he thinks of Lisa. With that, Louis agrees and is sent to a public flogging, though the executioner merely places him on his lap and pretends to beat him. Despite this leniency, Estienne later confronts Louis and declares that he won't let him have Lisa. He shoves Louis back, claiming Lisa is his. Jean-Francois is surprised, and Chris admits that Estienne is improvising. This makes Helene uneasy, suspecting the actor is getting too personally involved. Despite Estienne's threats, Louis suddenly stands up to him. However, instead of fighting for love, he backs down, much to Chris' disappointment. Helene assures them this is a good sign. It means Louis has finally recognized a mirror of his own behavior. She believes her stepson is beginning to wonder whether he truly deserves the reward, which shows he's starting to reflect on the consequences of his actions. As if to confirm her belief, Louis later asks Lisa if it bothers her that he's just a servant. She tells him not to define himself by his job. Instead, she encourages him to keep moving forward so he can return to his own time. Her words lift his spirits, so Louis later arranges a candlelit dinner to express his gratitude. The two begin spending more time together, but one day, Louis notices a bird flying oddly in the sky. It turns out that one of the drones has gone rogue, prompting Chris to instruct Lisa to divert Louis's attention. With no other option, Lisa grabs Louis and kisses him. Louis reciprocates the kiss but quickly apologizes when he senses her reluctance. Chris and Jean-Francois celebrate, recognizing how much Louis has truly transformed. However, Helene demands they end the project before Lisa and Louis genuinely fall in love. She reminds them that it's wrong to manipulate real emotions, but Chris insists on continuing his cinematic masterpiece. In response, Helene threatens to leave Jean-Francois if he doesn't shut everything down. Chris counters that halting the project would be equivalent to abandoning his son. Seeing her husband hesitate, a disheartened Helene storms out. Chris, unfazed, begins planning Louis's moment of heroism. Meanwhile, Jean-Francois realizes that the director cares more about his film than about helping Louis, so he orders Chris to terminate the project immediately. However, after Jean-Francois leaves, Chris disregards the command and moves on to the next phase. Soon, Sylvain informs Louis that Vikings are raiding their village. Louis suggests they flee, but Sylvain reminds him that Lisa is still there. Motivated, Louis hurries to the estate where the fake Vikings, led by Arnold, demand that a woman be given to them as a bride. Arnold chooses Lisa, but instead of intervening, a frightened Louis runs away. Ashamed, he heads back home until he spots one of the birds again. Recalling his kiss with Lisa, Louis jumps on a horse and races back to the estate, confronting the Vikings in a surprise attack. Startled by the assault, Arnold surrenders Lisa, and she and Louis flee into the forest together. Watching from afar, Chris proudly claims that this is the first time cinema has truly changed someone's life. Meanwhile, Jean-Francois tries to catch up with Helene to apologize. However, Louis and Lisa end up on the same road, where Louis sees passing cars. This convinces Helene that her husband is continuing the experiment, so she walks away once more. Before Louis can make sense of what's happening, he is hit with a tranquilizer dart. Shortly after, Louis wakes up back in his regular life, having been told that he was in a coma after being struck by a car. Despite regaining his freedom and wealth, the experience has deeply affected him. He feels detached from his old lifestyle. One evening, Louis has a conversation with his father, who has now stepped down from his company. With more free time, Jean-Francois admits to feeling lonely without Helene. In turn, Louis shares that he fell in love with Lisa during what he believed was a coma-induced dream. He reminds his father that, unlike Lisa, Helene is real, and he still has a chance to win her back. Haunted by guilt over the deception, Jean-Francois takes Louis to a ranch the next day. To Louis's amazement, Lisa is there, and the two are joyfully reunited. She leads him to the hotel his father owns, the site of the fabricated village, where they can now build a real life together, free from deceit. Jean-Francois also begins trying to make amends with Helene. Meanwhile, Chris launches a new production company that stages fictional experiences designed to help real people grow and change for the better.